August 14th, 2019. The rain had not stopped for 3 straight days in St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. Water flooded the dirt roads, spilled through the drainage ditches, and rolled across the sugarcane fields like dark rivers under the gray morning sky. Before sunrise, the ditch behind Clara May's farm overflowed again, and with it came the smell. Rotten sugarcane, wet ash, sour fermentation. By 6 in the morning, black cane waste from the Delmont sugar mill had washed straight into Clara's lower field. Thick piles of soaked fiber spread across the rows, while steam rose from the dark mound behind her property. People in town had been waiting years for something like this to happen. Inside Bernard's feed store, farmers stood near the coffee machine shaking their heads. That land's finished now. She should have sold it when Delmont offered. One hard flood and all that garbage finally poisoned the soil. Everybody knew about the waste pile behind Clara's farm. For over a decade, Delmont Sugar had dumped leftover cane fiber there because nobody else wanted it. Most folks called it industrial trash. Some even claimed it was toxic, but Clara had never tried to stop them. Not until that morning. Around noon, her old blue Ford pickup rattled into the sugar mill yard covered in mud. The truck looked older than half the workers standing there. Rust along the doors. One cracked headlight, exhaust coughing into the humid air. The workers stopped loading trucks just to watch her step out. Clara May was 62 years old, thin from a lifetime of work, wearing faded denim and brown work boots soaked black from the rain. She walked slowly toward the loading area without saying a word. Standing near the conveyor belts was Gavin Delmont, owner of the mill. Clean white shirt, gold watch, expensive sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. He looked more like a businessman from Dallas than somebody raised around fields. Clara pointed toward the smoking pile behind the mill. "You dump one more load behind my land," she said quietly, "and one day you'll regret it." For a moment, the yard went silent. Then Gavin laughed, a loud laugh, the kind meant for everybody around him. He spread his arms toward the giant pile of cane waste and shook his head. "Miss Clara," he said, grinning, "if that garbage was worth anything, you'd already be the richest woman in Louisiana." The workers burst out laughing. One man slapped the side of a truck. Another muttered, "Crazy old woman loves her trash mountain." Even the drivers standing near the gate were smiling now. But Clara never argued. She simply turned and looked back toward the flooded field beyond the fence. And strangely, she didn't look angry. She almost looked calm, because what nobody in that yard understood was that Clara May had never believed the pile was waste. And this story was never really about fertilizer. A week later, farmers from all across the parish gathered inside the old Civic Hall near Bayou Teche for the annual agriculture meeting. Seed companies handed out brochures. Equipment dealers showed off glossy advertisements for new harvesters and irrigation systems. Most people were nervous that year. Fertilizer prices had climbed too high. Rainfall predictions looked terrible. Another dry season was coming. Then Delmont Sugar gave their presentation. A young agricultural engineer named Trevor Pike walked onto the stage, carrying soil reports and satellite images from Baton Rouge University. He spoke confidently about modern soil management and efficient crop optimization. Halfway through the presentation, a photo of Clara's farm appeared on the screen behind him. Several people in the audience chuckled immediately. Trevor adjusted his glasses and pointed at the image. "This," he said, "is a clear example of long-term organic contamination caused by industrial cane byproduct exposure." More laughter spread through the room. He zoomed in on the dark soil covering Clara's fields. The microbial activity here is abnormally high. Heat retention is unstable. Decomposition levels are excessive. No professional operation would farm this way today. Near the back wall, Gavin Delmont stood with his arms crossed, smiling proudly while farmers shook their heads. Then Trevor looked directly toward Clara. "Sometimes," he said politely, "older farmers hold on to outdated methods because they're emotionally attached to the past." The room exploded with laughter. One farmer called out, "Tell her to plant crops, not garbage." Even Gavin laughed openly now, but Clara stayed quiet for a few seconds before finally standing up from her chair. "My father used to say," she began slowly, "soil talks." A few people rolled their eyes immediately, but most folks bury it under machines before they ever learn how to listen. Trevor gave the kind of smile educated men often give before dismissing somebody completely. With respect. "Ma'am," he replied. "Science tends to work better than superstition." The crowd laughed even harder this time, but Clara never reacted. She simply picked up her old straw hat and walked out of the hall alone while people were still laughing behind her. What nobody there understood was that Clara had heard those same laughs almost her entire life, because long before Gavin Delmont ever owned that mill, there had been another farmer standing in those same muddy fields, a quiet man named Eli May, Clara's father, back in the summer of 1973. Eli May already believed something most farmers considered foolish. He believed nothing from the land was ever truly waste. Not burnt stalks, not ash, not rotten cane fiber after every harvest season. While other farmers burned leftovers or dumped them away, Eli collected everything and hauled it behind the barn. Wet cane pulp, boiler ash, dead leaves, mill residue. The neighbors mocked him constantly. People called his land the junk farm. Clara still remembered hearing grown men laugh while her father turned steaming compost piles late at night beneath hanging lanterns. But Eli never argued with anyone. He simply worked. Every evening, he would kneel down, grab a handful of dark soil, and crumble it slowly between his fingers like a man studying gold dust. Healthy dirt stays alive. He once told Clara when she was 14 years old. She remembered the smell of those nights more than anything else. Wet earth after rain, sweet rot from decomposing cane, steam rising from the piles during cold mornings. Then came the drought of 1973. Fields across the parish dried out and cracked open under the heat. Farmers lost entire harvests. Yet somehow, Eli May's land stayed green. People drove miles just to stare at it from the roadside. Nobody understood why. Not the banks, not the agriculture office, not even the sugar mill owners. But Clara had seen the answer with her own eyes. Deep beneath the surface, the soil her father built held water differently. It breathed differently. And years later, after Eli May was gone, Clara slowly realized something even more important. Her father had never been storing waste behind the farm. He had been building something powerful enough to change the entire parish. By September, the heat arrived early. The rain disappeared almost overnight, leaving the fields around Street, Martin Parish, dry and brittle under the Louisiana sun. Dust rolled across the roads each afternoon, and farmers began watching the sky with the same nervous look. Everybody knew a bad season was coming. At Delmont Sugar Mill, Gavin saw opportunity in it. One evening, he drove out to Clara's farm personally for the first time in years. His black truck stopped beside the rusted gate, while Clara worked alone near the compost rows behind her barn. The smell out there was strong. Wet earth, fermentation, rotting cane fiber slowly breaking down beneath layers of ash and dark soil. Gavin stepped carefully through the mud like a man trying not to dirty expensive boots. "You still doing this?" he asked, looking around the piles. Clara kept shoveling without answering. Gavin pulled a folded document from his jacket. "I'll make this simple," he said. "I want the property." That finally made Clara stop. The land behind her farm sat exactly where Delmont Sugar planned to expand their drainage system and waste storage area. Everybody in town knew it. For years, Gavin had been trying to buy her out. And for years, Clara refused every offer. "This land's not for sale," she said quietly. Gavin sighed like a man losing patience with a child. "You're sitting on dead dirt and garbage," he replied. "Sooner or later, the bank's gonna realize it too." Then he handed her the paper. It was the biggest offer he had ever made. Enough money for Clara to leave Louisiana forever if she wanted. But she barely looked at it before folding it in half and giving it back. "Number," she said. Gavin stared at her for several seconds. Then something colder entered his expression. "Suit yourself," he muttered before walking back toward his truck. 3 days later, the dumping behind Clara's farm doubled. Truck after truck rolled behind the property line carrying wet cane residue from the mill. The pile grew so high that steam rose from it every morning like smoke from a furnace. People in town started whispering that Gavin was trying to force Clara out, but Clara still said nothing publicly. Every morning before sunrise, she walked through her fields alone carrying a shovel and an old metal thermometer that had once belonged to her father. And every morning, she checked the soil. What nobody understood yet was that Clara wasn't worried about the drought. She was watching something else. Because while nearby farms were beginning to dry out, her field still held moisture deep beneath the surface. Even stranger than that, the ground stayed warm. One morning, a young worker named Daniel Cruz noticed steam rising from Clara's lower field before sunrise. Not from the compost pile, from the dirt itself. At first he thought the field was burning underground. "Miss Clara," he said nervously, "you got heat coming out of the soil." Clara knelt down slowly and pressed her hand against the dark earth. Then she smiled for the first time in weeks. "It's alive," she said quietly. Daniel didn't understand what she meant then, but later, he would remember that moment clearly, because what Clara finally decided to reveal that season would shock the entire parish. A few days later, Trevor Pike, the same young engineer who mocked her at the farming meeting, returned to Clara's land with testing equipment from Baton Rouge. At first, he only came because of rumors. Farmers had started talking about Clara's field staying green despite the heat. Some even claimed her soil felt cooler beneath the surface than nearby farms. Trevor didn't believe any of it. He walked through the rows carrying instruments and sample bags, while Clara followed silently behind him. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered after checking moisture levels for the third time. Most farms in the parish had already started drying out badly, but Clara's soil still held deep moisture, nearly 2 feet underground. Then Trevor noticed something else. The organic layers beneath the surface were enormous. Years of decomposed cane waste had formed thick black soil rich with microbial life. The deeper he sampled, the more active it became. "What exactly did you put in this ground?" he asked. Clara looked toward the old compost rows behind the barn. "My father taught me how to feed soil slowly," she answered. That night, Trevor stayed longer than he planned, for the first time in his career. He watched Clara explain the process by hand, instead of from charts or laboratory reports. The cane fiber held moisture. The ash balanced acidity. The heat from decomposition protected microbial life underground. Layer after layer, year after year, the soil transformed itself. Not quickly, not magically, but patiently, like something alive. Trevor finally realized the terrible mistake everyone had made. Delmont Sugar believed they had been dumping waste behind Clara's farm for 12 years. In reality, they had been delivering raw material, and Clara May had quietly turned it into one of the richest natural compost systems in the entire parish. When Trevor's laboratory results came back from Baton Rouge a week later, even he stared at the numbers twice. Organic concentration levels were nearly unheard of. Water retention capacity was several times higher than surrounding farmland. Microbial density was so strong that parts of the soil continued generating heat before sunrise. For the first time, Trevor Pike stopped laughing at Clara May, and he wasn't the only one. By October, the drought became severe. Fields across southern Louisiana started turning pale yellow under the relentless heat. Corn wilted. Cane stalks weakened. Entire harvest projections collapsed in less than 3 weeks. Farmers grew desperate. Some prayed for rain. Others blamed fertilizer prices, bad seed, or government forecasts. But then people started driving past Clara's property, and what they saw made them slow down. Her fields were still green, not barely surviving. Green, healthy, dense. The difference was so obvious, it almost looked unnatural beside the dying farms around her. Soon, trucks began parking along the roadside just to stare at the land. Even men who had laughed at Clara weeks earlier now stood silently near her fence, watching the wind move through thick rows of healthy cane. Nobody joked anymore. Then local reporters arrived. After that came agricultural inspectors. And finally, Gavin Delmont himself. He stood at the edge of Clara's field one late afternoon, watching workers cut sample stalks nearly twice the thickness of nearby crops. For the first time in years, he looked nervous, because suddenly the entire parish was asking the same question. How did the crazy old woman with the garbage pile become the only farmer surviving the drought? And deep down, Gavin already knew the answer. The thing he had mocked for years was becoming the most valuable thing in Louisiana. The biggest moment came in November, during the annual Louisiana Cane Exchange auction in Lafayette. Every major grower in the region was there. Farm owners, mill operators, Agricultural investors, reporters from Baton Rouge and New Orleans, after the drought destroyed nearly half the season's production. Sugar prices had climbed higher than anyone expected, and for the first time in years, everybody wanted to see Clara May. By sunrise, trucks filled the auction grounds while crowds gathered around the weighing stations. Most farmers arrived with weak, dry-looking cane stalks after months of brutal heat. Then Clara's old blue Ford rolled slowly through the front gate, pulling a rusted flatbed trailer behind it. The entire place seemed to notice. People stopped talking. On the trailer sat some of the healthiest sugarcane anyone there had seen all season. Thick green stalks stacked shoulder-high, still heavy with moisture, despite the drought that had crippled farms across the parish. Even the inspectors looked stunned. One man cut open a stalk with his pocket knife and shook his head. "Good Lord," he whispered. "This cane's still alive." Nearby reporters immediately surrounded the trailer, while cameras flashed through the morning fog. And standing near the crowd, watching everything unfold, was Gavin Delmont. For once, he wasn't smiling. The official testing began around noon. Agricultural specialists measured sugar content, moisture retention, and soil performance reports taken from Clara's farm weeks earlier. One by one, the results confirmed the same unbelievable truth. Her land had outperformed nearly every commercial farm in southern Louisiana, not because of expensive chemicals, not because of advanced irrigation systems, but because of the same cane waste everybody had mocked for years. As the crowd grew larger, people started whispering openly now. "That old woman figured something out. My grandfather used to compost like that. Maybe we stopped listening too soon." Then came the moment nobody forgot. A representative from a large agricultural corporation stepped forward and offered Clara a private contract worth several $1,000,000 for her composting process and soil research rights. The crowd erupted instantly. People turned toward Clara, waiting for her answer. Before she could speak, Gavin suddenly stepped in. "Well," he said loudly, forcing a smile, "I suppose Delmont Sugar deserves some credit here too. After all, we supplied the material." Some people nodded awkwardly. Others stayed quiet. Clara looked at Gavin for a long moment. Then she finally spoke. "Number," she said calmly. "You dumped it because you thought it was worthless." The crowd went silent. Clara stepped closer to the trailer and rested one weathered hand against the fresh green cane. "My father spent his whole life teaching me that nothing from the land is useless if you understand it properly." Gavin's smile faded. "You didn't build this," Clara continued quietly. "You threw it away." Nobody laughed this time. Not a single person. For several seconds, the only sound came from the auction fans turning overhead in the heat. Then somewhere in the back of the crowd, somebody started clapping. Another joined. Then another, until the entire auction yard erupted into applause. The same farmers who once called Clara crazy now stood cheering for her openly. Some even removed their hats. And what happened next surprised people even more than the harvest itself. Clara turned down the corporation's offer. She refused to sell the process exclusively. Instead, over the following months, she invited struggling farmers from across the parish to her land and taught them how to build healthy compost systems for free. Young farmers showed up first, then older ones. Even men who had laughed at her during the agriculture meeting quietly came asking questions, and Clara helped every one of them. She never mentioned the humiliation, never demanded apologies, never acted proud. She simply taught them the same way her father once taught her, slowly, patiently, like the soil itself. But the consequences for Gavin Delmont were very different. Once state inspectors realized the mill had been dumping massive amounts of usable organic material as waste for years. Investigations began almost immediately. Environmental agencies questioned Delmont Sugar's disposal practices. Several expensive contracts disappeared within months. By the next summer, Gavin's expansion project had completely collapsed. People around town still talked about the irony of it all. The rich man who treated the land like a dumping ground nearly lost everything, and the quiet woman everybody mocked became the person farmers trusted most. A year later, the road behind Clara's farm looked completely different. The old waste pile was gone. In its place stood long, organized rows of controlled compost beds, covered beneath wooden frames and dark canvas sheets. Steam still rose gently from them during cool mornings. But now people came there to learn. Pickup trucks lined the roadside almost every weekend. Young farmers walked through the fields carrying notebooks, while Clara explained moisture layers, decomposition timing, and soil balance in her calm, quiet voice. Sometimes school groups visited too. Children who once held their noses passing the road now stood amazed, while Clara showed them how black, living soil crumbled softly between her fingers. And despite everything that had happened, Clara herself barely changed at all. She still lived in the same old farmhouse, still drove the same rattling blue Ford pickup, still woke before sunrise every morning to walk the fields alone. One evening, near harvest season, Daniel Cruz found her standing beside the lower field, watching the sunset turn the cane gold beneath the wind. "You ever think about retiring?" he asked. Clara smiled faintly. Then she bent down and picked up a handful of dark earth from the edge of the row. For a moment, she simply held it quietly in her palm. "My father used to tell me something," she said softly. "People get arrogant when they stop respecting small things." Daniel looked out across the fields glowing under the evening light. Clara closed her hand gently around the soil. "Most folks saw garbage," she continued, "but the land saw food. The wind moved slowly through the cane around them. And maybe that was the real reason this story stayed alive long after the drought ended. Not because a woman saved her farm, not because a rich man was embarrassed in public, but because it reminded people of something the modern world forgets too easily. Just because something looks old doesn't mean it has no value. Just because someone speaks quietly doesn't mean they have nothing worth hearing. And sometimes, the people laughed at the hardest are the ones listening closely enough to understand what everybody else ignored. Because in the end, Clara May proved something no machine, no degree, and no amount of money could replace. Wisdom is not always invented. Sometimes it is simply remembered.